Earlier this week, on Monday, the 25th of March, the new president of the Eurogroup, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, stated that the developments in Cyprus, wherein the depositors in the Cyprus banks were fleeced out of billions of euros of money to bail out the insolvent European financial system, that this, according to Dijsselbloem, was actually going to be a template or a model for what was going to be done in other countries as well. Now, that excessively frank remark from Mr. Dijsselbloem caused a flurry of responses, since it produced a political panic of sorts and also the beginnings of a bank run, or the rumblings of a bank run in a number of countries. Immediately, the working group, the Eurogroup working group, prepared an internal memorandum, which, according to the Wall Street Journal, states that no way, Cyprus is not a template for any other country. And then the Prime Minister of Spain, Mariano Rajoy, at a joint press conference with François Hollande of France, issued a statement where he emphatically, categorically denied that what had happened in Cyprus could conceivably ever happen in any other country. He said, and I quote, "The problem of the Cypriot banking sector is different than the rest of Europe. The decision adopted is extraordinary and unique and will be applied in an extraordinary manner and only to Cyprus." Now, while Rajoy was acting for all the world like Pinocchio, you had at the same time the governments of Luxembourg and Portugal simultaneously saying that this type of measure of simply stealing bank deposits could never possibly happen in any other country. The fact of the matter, of course, is that the dam has been breached, that the fact that this occurred in Cyprus is exactly an indication of what is to come. Or actually, my verb should there be not what is to come, but what is already happening elsewhere. And I think that what's really most interesting is that while Rajoy was lying through his teeth, his own government was in the process of announcing, through the form of the deputy economics minister of the country, Fernando Jimenez, to a Spanish Senate committee that they had reached the terms, the long-awaited terms, of an agreement for rolling up 5 bankrupt banks in Spain. The biggest one and the best known is Bankia, which went bust many months ago. And as per the terms imposed on Spain from the outside, just as in the Cyprus case, imposed on Spain from the outside by a memorandum of understanding signed in July of 2012, last year, between Spain and the widely detested Troika, meaning the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the International Monetary Fund, that the terms of bankruptcy reorganization of Bankia and the other 4 banks that went under was that stockholders in the bank would be forced to take a significant write-down in their stock holdings in the company. Now, what you need to know, and this is where the scandal just begins, is that most of the stockholders in Bankia are former small depositors in the bank who were defrauded, were falsely, fraudulently sold what are called preferred stocks in the bank. The retail branches of Bankia and other banks sold their own depositors preferred stocks, referred to in Spain as preferentes, which they took their savings, their deposits, and bought these preferred stocks. So that the vast majority of the so-called stockholders in Bankia are actually small depositors who have just been fleeced. There are over 1 million such families of preferentes or preferred stockholders in Spain. The terms of the Bankia reorganization has 2 parts. Now, it's very technical and detailed, and I'm not going to go into it, but it's basically 2 components. First, the preferred stocks themselves have been forced to take a write-down of between 30 and 70%. Boom, gone. Then these preferred stockholders, preferred, I guess, only because they're certainly preferred by the international creditors who are fleecing them, their preferred stocks are then being converted into common stocks in the bank. What's happening to the common stocks which they are forcibly being given in exchange for the preferred stocks after the write-down? Well, the per share value of Bankia last week was €2 per stock. The price for the common stock in Bankia now, after the reorganization, is 1 cent of a euro. In other words, less than 1%, 0.5% of its prior value. So they got written off 30 to 70%, and then a 99% write-down after that. Now, this has caused an uproar in Spain, as you might well imagine. The total amount of money being robbed from Spaniards, just as in the Cyprus situation, is in the range of 6 billion euros and counting. And there are a couple of interesting aspects about this thing. First of all, let's just for a second take a step back and say, what does it mean to say that Cyprus is a template for the rest of Europe? Well, the most recent official figures, if you look at the amount of public debt held by the European banking institutions, in other words, the whole bankrupt London-centered shebang of banks, and the amount of debt that is held in each of the European countries, the total amount held all across Europe is 3.6 trillion euros. Now, the amount in Cyprus is only 3.1 billion euros. In other words, Cyprus is less than 0.1% of the total exposure of the banks to sovereign debt across Europe. So this really is a tiny straw that is breaking the camel's back there. Much bigger is Spain with 188 billion, bigger still Italy with 280 billion. In the Spanish case, it's about 5% of the total. So if you take the template applied in Cyprus at 0.1% and are broadly applying it across the board, I think you get the idea of what's going on here. What's going on here is that the game is over. Mario Draghi, the head of the Central Bank of Europe, was up until recently singing loud and clear, no problem, we're going to keep pumping money in, there's never going to be a bankruptcy, the music is going to keep playing. People will recall the old children's game of musical chairs where there's 4 chairs and 5 people, and while the music plays, people walk around the chairs. And when the music stops, the 5 people have to sit down in the 4 chairs. And of course, one can't make it, and he's out, and then it continues with 4 and 3. Well, Draghi said, don't worry, the music is going to play forever. What has now happened is that the music has stopped. The game is over, and the fight is, and this is a massive political war, who is going to pay for the absolutely unpayable, bankrupt financial system? Because this is not a case of 5 people in 4 chairs. You're talking about 600 people in 2 chairs, and probably one of them is a hologram. It's just financial derivatives and doesn't exist. So the big hit, the big question is who picks up the tab? Who pays for this? And what it means to say that Cyprus is a template means that the population of Europe is going to be fleeced and destroyed and killed to pay for this. And there is one alternative, and only one alternative, and that is that instead of killing off the population, the financial cancer is killed instead. That 3.6 trillion and then some in completely unpayable debt is simply left for the banks to resolve. The governments don't pay it, the people don't pay it. The cancer can survive on its own, but not on the healthy tissue of the economy. And what's coming out of the City of London now, and what's coming out of Wall Street now, is the line that no, this has got to be paid by the population killing them off. So there's really only one answer. There's only one alternative to the kind of death and robbery and theft being imposed upon Europe and across the Atlantic into the United States. And that alternative is the Glass-Steagall bill, which needs to be applied not only in the United States but internationally as well. Now, it's actually of some interest, if you look at this situation, to take note of the fact that this same type of fraudulent sale of so-called preferred stocks that has occurred in the case of Spain to the tune of billions of euros, saddling over 1 million households with this fraudulent debt. And by the way, they were sold these instruments with the idea that they were kind of term deposits, but with very high interest rates. Some of these shares were in fact never able to be cashed in, and in many cases the term was, believe it or not, 1,000 years. So this is the modern version of the 1,000-year Reich that we're talking about here, Hitler style. So, but it's very interesting that exactly this kind of operation with preferred stocks, which has been going on in Spain, was what was happening in the United States in the early 1930s. And it was studied and exposed by the Pecora Commission under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in cases such as First National Citibank, the precursor of Citibank today, they were caught red-handed fleecing people in exactly the same fashion. And it was the Pecora Commission which exposed these and related crimes, which laid the basis for, among other things, throwing these guilty parties in jail, which certainly should be done, but most significantly, the complete reorganization of the banking and financial system according to the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. So there is a real historic parallel here. There's a sense of déjà vu that we should have. There's nothing new under the sun in terms of how these people think of killing and robbing people. And all that we need to do to put an end to this thing is to return, and immediately, to the Glass-Steagall law passed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. It's the only way to stop the crimes going on, not only in Spain or in Cyprus or in Greece or Portugal, across Europe, but the same crimes which are already being committed in the United States as well. But I want to mention that in the case of Spain specifically, where there are protest demonstrations at this point, both against this double robbery which has occurred with the preferente stocks, and also against the evictions which are occurring right and left across Spain as people are thrown out of their houses because they can't meet their mortgage payments. But there is a tremendous amount of protest and demonstrations against this. The government of Spain and the media in Spain and in Europe are kind of whistling past the graveyard and saying, oh no, not here. But the population knows better. Their view you could summarize as saying, wait a minute, we live in the graveyard. What are you talking about? And what you have, for example, in addition to these demonstrations, the LaRouche movement in Spain, which is fairly recently established, the Movimiento LaRouche España, has put out a statement over this course of this week on the lessons of Cyprus, which says that the only choice that Spain and other countries face is to go down to the same type of devastation as Cyprus, or to implement Glass-Steagall, leave the Europe, establish a sovereign credit system, and proceed from there. This is being widely distributed across Spain, and particularly interesting is the fact that Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, in his webcast, most recent webcast, in response to a question on Cyprus, gave a programmatic response. The Spanish language translation of that answer of Mr. LaRouche's has been circulating very widely and rapidly across Spain on the YouTube channel of the Spain LaRouche movement. And every time we check, the number of viewers of that have gone up. It is now over 2,000, which is quite significant given the relatively modest platform that we are beginning from in the Spanish situation. But this situation across Europe, where the ideas of Mr. LaRouche and the policies presented by Helga Zepp LaRouche and by the Schiller Institute around a program for the rapid economic development of the entire European region, the kinds of issues that were discussed in the recent Schiller Institute conference in the United States and an earlier one in Europe at the end of last year, these ideas are the ones that are filling a vacuum of lack of other proposals, and I would say kind of a vacuum of otherwise despair and rage at what is a situation which is simply not manageable. So people are turning to other alternatives, and the voice of LaRouche is now being heard very loudly and very clear across Europe.